Now I would like to ask Mr. Bayo Akindeinde. He's a consultant, private sector development expert and consultant on UK DFID and also World Bank programs. The floor is yours.
Dobry den. I would have loved to do my presentation in Czech, but I'm afraid I'll stick with English. It's much easier for me. Before I came here, I put together a set of slides, but having listened to the first two speakers, I'm afraid I'm changing my presentation completely. Because they have set the scene, if you like, for a completely different understanding of why we're here this morning. So the first thing I would like to do is just very quickly run through my slides, but very briefly, and then move on to some of the topics that they've hinted on in their presentation, because I think it's much more interesting to follow the same path as they have followed. So that's the agenda. So the first thing is, and please, I don't mean to insult your intelligence, but what I'd like to do, because I think it's useful, is to define what we understand as development aid, and then I'll move on. Because sometimes we all make mistakes in terms of understanding the difference between humanitarian aid, development assistance, and development aid. So I thought it'd be useful, I'm not going to read through everything on the slide, but I think it's useful to understand what exactly we mean by development aid. It's basically support to an emerging or developing economy, or if you like, with the old countries like yours who joined the EU, in transition economies, supporting them to move on to the next level. That's what development aid is. And basically, it comes from Western industrialized nations supporting other economies. The next thing is to understand the difference between bilateral and multilateral aid. So it's very simple. Bilateral aid is one country supporting another country, whereas multilateral is when you have countries coming together to put together a basket or a pool of funds to support a country or a group of countries. So for example, my colleague Vera and I served on the board of the ACP in Brussels, basically looking at how the EU would support emerging African Caribbean economies. That's a sort of understanding. So I thought it'd be useful to define that as well. And then the example I've given there is that about 70% of aid is from bilateral and 30% from multilateral. So, Mr. Shooter mentioned the issue of GDP, and I'm sure you know that the UK is one of the, I think, the only 5 countries who have committed to 7% of our GDP being committed to international development. 7%, sorry, 0.7% of GDP being committed to international development. What does that mean in actual numbers? In actual numbers, that is 11.4 billion. 11.4 billion committed to international development last year. That's a significant sum. So that shows you the level of involvement of the UK government in addressing issues in developing economies. It then begs the question, which is why we're here this morning, what is the role of the private sector in accessing those funds and in shaping how the funds are spent? So I'll come back to those 2 key questions later. We then move on to the issue of aid for trade. Again, as I said, my 2 colleagues earlier mentioned the issue of aid for trade. That is very important because what is happening now is, as I said, we've defined what we mean by international aid. The question now is, what are we looking at? We're looking at supporting developing countries go through the constraints that is stopping them from trading. Because if you look at most developing countries, it's quite interesting. They've got commodities, they've got the climate, they've got everything. Yet, the level of trade is very low. The level of trade between developing countries is very low. The level of value added is very low. So you ask the question, what is the problem? The problem is a whole host of constraints. And what the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is doing is saying, look, how can we help you address these particular constraints? Because if you're able to address those constraints and you're able to trade better amongst yourselves, for starters, that's the first. Forget about exporting to developed countries. If you're able to trade amongst yourselves, for starters, that's the first step in addressing the issue of poverty, in addressing the issue of improvement in livelihoods. So that's the first step. And My colleagues also mentioned untying aid, because in the past, I must admit, aid used to be tied. So you'd get a donor country saying, right, we're going to give you some support, but of course, only companies or contractors from that country benefit from that support. That's changing rapidly. It's changing very fast. So most aid is now untied. Basically, what it means in simple jargon is this. I can only give you the example of the UK government, of DFID, who I know quite well. If DFID puts out a contract, anybody can bid for the contract. You don't have to be a British company to bid for the contract. You don't have to be a Brit to work with DFID on a DFID program. So that aid is untied. It's open to the best value for money provider of support. However, I'm giving an example here, and I don't mean to name countries, I hope I don't get into trouble. A lot of Chinese aid is tied aid, which is quite interesting, because I used to do a lot of work in Central Eastern Europe. Now most of my work is in Sub-Saharan Africa. And what I've noticed is that, yes, Chinese give aid. I'm not a diplomat, so I can say this. But on the other hand, that aid is tied. So what you will get is the Chinese commercial bank saying, here you go, here's $2.2 million to build a new stadium or a new hospital, but it has to be a Chinese contractor. So that's an issue that I think is going to be looked at. And that's an issue that requires a bit of dialogue, a bit of support to understand it should be the best value for money when you're giving support. Right. Again, I'm not going to go through the 4 components of the WTO's definition of looking at this issue of aid for trade, but very briefly, is looking at trade policy and regulations. So what are the policies holding in emerging economies? And what are the policies, if you like, of the EU, for example, that could be a constraint to suppliers from emerging economies? Because that's a barrier to trade. Economic infrastructure. What's the capacity within ministries in these countries? Are they able to go ahead? What's the economic policy? The productive capacity as well is a big issue. So a lot of international aid goes to developing productive capacity, because that is a real big problem. Identifying individuals with the skills, enabling knowledge transfer, and improving the capacity. And a 4th element of it is adjustment assistance. That sounds very grand, but it's basically supporting with transition. Understanding this is how the rest of the world moves, can you follow with that particular pace? So these are the key 4 areas in terms of looking at how the WTO is saying we can look at the issue of aid for trade. So now back to the key question, which is why we're here. As I said, I've changed my presentation, and I'm going to pose 2 questions first that I think maybe we'll think about and maybe try and answer, not just as a panel, but as I think to have more discussion with you as well as listeners. The first question is this. Everybody says, and we all agree, that the private sector is ideally positioned to create jobs. What government does is an enabler. Government doesn't create jobs. Government enables the creation of jobs. So the private sector does that. So there are 2 questions. The first question, therefore, is, to what extent can the private sector be involved in shaping and positioning the delivery of international aid? I'll repeat that question again. To what extent can the private sector be involved in shaping and positioning the delivery of international aid? So government is the enabler. Government, from your taxpayers' money, says, yes, we're devoting X percentage to international aid. But what's the role of the private sector in delivering that aid? The second question is then, for this particular session, is determining the extent to which Czech SMEs are able to make an impact in the delivery of international aid. Because here we are in Prague, talking about international aid. The key question is, fine, wonderful, what are Czech SMEs doing in that sphere? Yesterday we had a conference organized by my colleague Vera, where we looked at lots of companies, and I spoke to individuals who were supplying medical implants, doing work on renewable energy. That's wonderful. The question then is, to what extent are Czech SMEs able to transfer this knowledge when the Czech government is spending its money in international aid? That's the key question. If we're able to address that, I think through dialogue, then we're on the right track. Because what it means then is that you're in a position to transfer what you understand and what you know allied with what we talked about in terms of what the WTO is doing in aid for trade. So that's my understanding of how it's meant to work. International aid or public sector funds is meant to act as a catalyst. It's not meant to do the job in itself. So I always tell people, aid is not meant to solve the problem of emerging countries. What it's meant to do, it's demonstrate via pilots what can be done. Now, the role of the private sector is to replicate that pilot. So government goes in, tests something as a pilot to see how it works. The private sector's role then is to come in on the back of government to say, you know what, you've spent public money trying something out. You've seen how it works. How do you replicate it as a private sector? How do you make profit from it? Creating jobs, improving livelihoods, creating more employment, adding value. So it's the challenge, like I said, I've changed my presentation from simply talking about what was in my presentation pack, but I'm actually turning it around. The challenge to you is how can you benefit, how can you take advantage of the money your government has spent in international aid by capitalizing on that. There are lots of issues. As we all know, there's the issue now of environmental change, the circular economy, green economy, and all that stuff. Again, it sounds wonderful, but the real issue is this. How are you able to capitalize on that? The governments, the EU spent a lot of money on that. I'm not quite sure that we're ideally positioned to do that. And what I'm going to do is leave it here for now, and I think we should have more of an interaction and discussion. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for interesting presentation and to a very large extent listening to Mr. Schütte. We started an effort to find a common language or common ground, which is very important. Two questions you posed, we're definitely going to get back to those at the end of today's panel.